G'day guys, in this video I'm going to talk about the ever controversial topic of gain staging. Now you're probably wondering what my opinion on this is, and I do think that gain staging is pretty important, but do I think it is as important as some people make it out to be? Maybe not. I'm going to take you through how I go about gain staging a session and how this has actually just become a natural part of my process. So before I made this video, I thought, this is a pretty touchy subject for some people. I'm going to jump in to a bunch of different videos online and have a look at what the commenters had to say. So I looked at a whole bunch of different YouTube videos. I didn't actually watch or listen to what these guys had to say. I rather went into the comments and read what you guys had to say about gain staging, and it was it's pretty vicious out there. There's definitely some very negative comments, some pretty stubborn opinions. There's definitely people who didn't really care about it, and there's some people who really cared about it. And then there's people kind of like me who are kind of just in the middle saying, yeah, it's important, but maybe not as important as you're making it out to be. So I'm probably going to get a bunch of comments below telling me how wrong I am about this, but I figured let's just go for it. I've had a whole bunch of people asking me to share my opinions on this, so why not? Let's dive into it. So for me, gain staging starts as soon as you go to record a sound. The very beginning of your project, so you set up a mic on an acoustic guitar and you set the gain on your preamp. This is where it all begins, and setting the appropriate gain for the source that you're working on with the microphone that you're using is super important. It's also really important because you have to consider signal to noise ratio. So if you're recording something like finger-picked acoustic guitar and you put up a mic that has a really high self noise and you crank the gain up to get a good healthy signal on your guitar, you're introducing noise at the source when you should have chosen a better mic that was more appropriate for that tracking session. So that's an important thing that you have to be thinking about when you're tracking, getting the gain right at the source, choosing the right mics to avoid noise. Now, gain staging is also important if, say, you were tracking with a compressor or an EQ after the fact. You might be driving your preamp hard for saturation, for a bit of color, but it's hitting then the compressor too hard, it's coming in too hot, and you're actually overloading or overdriving that next piece of hardware, whereas you might need to use a trim on your preamp to dial that back to start bringing it back into a healthy level into the next piece of gear so that the input is not overloading, and that way the gain staging is nice through these pieces of gear. So that's when you're thinking about outboard gear, analog gear, getting the levels right across a couple of pieces of gear while tracking. And then when you bring it into your DAW, you want to make sure that you are not cranking it too hot. So it used to be a really big thing about getting the hottest signal you could into your DAW without clipping. And while I am about getting a nice healthy signal, I would definitely avoid trying to get your signal to hit as close to zero as possible. Even though for most of the performance it may not clip, there is the chance that something extra loud is going to happen at some point and you will get clipping. You're always safer to keep that input gain a little bit lower, so you're hitting around -6 at your loudest peaks. And I'm not saying that -6 is the level to aim for when bringing a signal into your DAW, but you just need to be aware that you want a decent signal coming in and nothing is clipping. That is obviously the most important thing, that you never clip while tracking, and that's an important part of your gain staging. It's just getting these signals so that they're healthy, they're not too quiet, they're not too loud, you're coming in at a sweet spot. Now, I know a lot of people talk about -12 and -18 being kind of in that sweet spot as to where your signal should sit. And so this is an interesting thing because I don't really ever think about this. When I'm tracking, my goal is always to get a nice healthy signal into the computer without it clipping. And that is always the most important thing. You never want to clip your converters going in, but you might want to drive your boutique analog preamps and clip those. But as long as you have a trim that you can dial it back, then you might be getting a special effect from that saturation and overdrive. But you don't want to actually ever get digital clipping on the way in. So for example, here's a session that I recorded very recently. It's a work in progress. I haven't finished mixing this yet. And I'm just going to show you the tracks. This is what they look like coming into the DAW. So we've got our drums, bass, acoustic guitars, some clean electric guitars, more electric guitars, more electric guitars, more electric guitars, and I got some MIDI and some vocals. And as you can see, nothing is actually coming in that hot. And that is the way I'll typically go about tracking stuff. I don't need it to be super hot on the way in. You just have to make sure that you get those stages right while you're tracking to avoid getting excess noise from your preamps and from your microphones. And then if you have a nice healthy signal where your peaks are not really hitting more than -6, then you're going to be bringing these in at a good working level. They're kind of in the right spot to go. So here's a little taste of the track just to get a feel for what we're doing here.
I can see that you wasted in a dead-end job. Too good for work in a 9 to 5 club. A ribbon road is calling us out of here.
So what you'll notice there is if you look at all those faders, nothing is going over 0. Everything's nice and healthy. We're all in the green, maybe a little bit of yellow, but never hitting the red, never going over. And doesn't matter if you go over in your DAW. In Logic, no, it doesn't matter. It doesn't actually hit the red and start distorting and sound bad. You can literally push it up as hard as you want and it won't distort. It'll probably start distorting your hardware out here, but in the box, I think there's kind of like an infinite ceiling until you export the track. And then if you have your master bus in the red and you hit export, then when you listen to that track outside of Logic, it'll sound terrible because you'll have all of that digital clipping happening. So that is also an important point where getting your gain staging is right to avoid stuff like that. And so when I'm tracking vocals, I'm usually running them through like the Audioscape Opto that I have over here, and it's the same deal. Like I'll set the preamp volume, I'll get the vocalist to do a take through the song, and I'll just make sure that as they're singing, they're hitting all those loud parts, that my preamp gain is never going to clip. You know, I have it set where I'm getting the desired sound out of the microphone, but I don't want any clipping. And then I'll feed that into my compressor, and then I will check the gain reduction and I'll check the output, and I'll make sure that the output's not too hot, because as we can see here, when you have a hot output, you get even more saturation. And I'll just make sure I'm getting the right amount of gain reduction, the right amount of gain by checking the output on the Audioscape that we're getting around 0 on the +4, and then coming over here and making sure it's coming in around -6. We're just not going to get any unwanted noise from any of these pieces of gear. And so for example, let's just pull up like the bass DI, okay? Now I'm going to put the Waves VU meter on here. I have not altered this session in any way. I've just opened this up to show you what's going on here and how this is just mindlessly become a part of my process, but it actually is quite important to getting a nice setup for mixing your song without having to do anything extra or any sort of like fussy gain changes later to get yourself into that magic sweet spot of -18, -12 decibels. So what I've heard people say is that the sweet spot for your gain on your tracks should be around 0, and then your tracks will end up being around -18, -12 dBs. So let's have a little look at what's going on here. This is just the level that I've tracked the bass to come in at. So you can see we've got a nice healthy signal. Peaks sometimes were around -7, and then it was hitting -13. So it seems like it's in a kind of sweet spot, and I haven't had to do any kind of like normalizations or changing of gains to get it into this good sweet spot. Now let's have a look at acoustic guitar. So same deal, it's hitting around that 0. We've got some peaks around -5 down here, sort of around -6. And then in between it's averaging around -10. So maybe for some people, they might be like, that's a little hot, I want to back that off. But for me, I don't really see much purpose in doing that. So I'm not going to change that. And so you might say, oh, but you know, plugins are made to receive the signal better at -18 or whatever. But the thing is, a lot of plugins have an input trim and an output trim, and unless you can actually hear the sound overloading, you're probably not actually doing any damage to it. If this was really hot and coming into a plugin, then yeah, you might hear some distortion. But on my acoustic bus, I'm using the BX Console SSL 4000E, and let's have a little look at this and see if it's overloading or causing any issues when we listen back to this. That sounds completely fine. There's no issue there. You just have to watch when you're using a plugin to see if it is overloading. And a lot of plugins are going to have an input trim. So if you see that it's coming in hot and it's clipping the input, just pull that input down a little bit. Just balance it back on the output once you're done. It's really simple, and you kind of have to do your gain staging throughout your mixing as well. Occasionally, you're going to want a signal to be hotter afterwards when you're mixing anyway. I know that I'm not always making sure everything's level matched while I'm mixing. Sometimes I want to boost a signal through something, and I will, and I'll get a little bit of extra volume from it, and that's what I wanted. Really comes down to a bit of like personal taste on this stuff. And so another example of where I'm not going to worry too much about gain staging is, let's see, our DI guitar here that I've tracked alongside our guitar amp. And you can see it's a bit hotter than the actual signal from the amp. You know, we got some peaks here that were pretty juicy, but they didn't clip, so it's not a problem. But, you know, maybe feeding them into something might be a little bit hot. Most VST guitar amps have an input trim, so you really don't need to go and play with the actual gain of this and put it down to minus 12, minus 18 dB. You can just play with the trim on a plugin to set it in the right spot anyway. And you're going to need to maybe if you pull it down to minus 18, you're going to need to drive that sucker back up to get the amount of crunch or drive you want from that VST guitar amp. Or you could have just maybe pulled the input down a little bit on the plugin and you'd be sweet. So I really don't think you would need to change a gain on that, and that would just be like creating an extra step for the sake of it. So I could go through a whole bunch of these tracks and show you the same thing, put the VU meter on it, show you where it's all sitting, and it's all going to be fairly similar. It's not going to be exactly the same, but it's going to be similar. And the point is, like, I would not bother going through your tracks and normalizing them to a set level. And even when someone sends me a project and say like they have their bass guitar at minus 1 dB, it's just like super loud, I'm not going to go in and change the gain on that. But what I might do is I might put a gain plugin on it. So let's just say this was the bass track. I would put a gain plugin on it, and then maybe I'd bring it down like 6 dB or something like that, just to get those top peaks away from the ceiling. Gives us a little bit of room for playing with plugins, gives us a bit of room to play with the fader so it's not as hot anymore. And the same goes for if someone sent you a signal that was super quiet and you couldn't see it. Yes, you could go into the audio editor, you know, you could click on it, you come in here and go file, change gain or normalize, and you could boost it all up. But the reason I would suggest maybe not doing that, I've had instances where I'm working on a project and then the artist or the engineer will say, hey, I just want to resend you some tracks, I've made some changes to them. And then you have to just delete out the tracks and dump these new ones in. And if you've been messing around with the gains of the tracks and you can't remember what you've done, it makes it really annoying getting it back to that same place that you had it. So by using a plugin, you're keeping the gain the same, they're going to send you the tracks again, it'll just drop in the same. And that's just to kind of like, just avoid any annoying problems. And so for a quick example, see these samples here, right? They're normalized to be basically 0. And I have pulled the tambourine down minus 22 dB. Is that a problem? Not really, no. I'm just not going to go in and change the gain of this just because someone said it should be minus 18. I just turn the fader down. That's fine. It doesn't really matter. Literally doesn't matter. But for example, let's demonstrate the effects of if you fed something too hot into one of these compressors, what's it going to do? So let's just pull up UAD LA2A. It's probably a weird choice for a tambourine, but whatever. Okay, this is sort of my default setting I've made for this. Couple of dBs of gain reduction. Check the output. It's hitting around 0. Let's bypass it. Okay, this is a super hot signal. It's literally not creating any distortion in this plugin at the moment. I literally can't overload this compressor with a super hot tambourine sound and make it distort for you right now, but I can show you what it sounds like if we have the output too hot on this. So you can see these plugins do react in a way that emulates analog gear. If you were pushing a signal really hard through it, it would eventually start to distort and saturate. So you definitely need to play with the gain staging in your plugins. But that should just kind of be like common sense, like feeding a signal in, making sure it's not too hot coming out. It makes sense to me. But there are times when you might want to push a plugin like that, but there's no post trim on that plugin. So you might have to drive it really hard and then use like a gain plugin after it to bring it back down to a safe level. There's just sort of things that you just have to play around with to make sure the levels aren't getting too crazy, but you can still get the desired effects. So this is where I think the importance of it plays into it though, is that you don't have super hot signals, But the way that you then go and balance out your mix as well, so getting your levels, that is still part of the whole gain stage, right? You might have your healthy gains coming in, so all your signals here, you got them all set nicely, and then you go into mixing, you set your levels, you do your panning, do any of your compressions and EQs and stuff like that. But then the other thing you have to think about is how all of this stuff comes together at the mix bus. So all your sounds, once they come together, are they clipping your mix bus? What is the sweet spot to aim for on your mix bus? And so realistically, my answer to this is, as long as you're not clipping, you're not going over 0, then that is perfectly fine on the mix bus. If you were hitting like minus 0.1 on the mix bus and you exported that for mastering, it's literally fine. It's not a problem. It's when you go over 0 and you export a track, then it becomes problematic. But it's saying that I would highly recommend aiming for your peaks of your mix to be landing anywhere between like -6 to -3 dBs. Just try not to go over. And that's not because it's like the mastering engineer needs headroom, because as long as you're not clipping, they can adjust the gain on there and it's not going to introduce any more or less noise than you already have built into your mix. But just to be safe, try and keep the peaks of your mix hitting around -3 to -6 dB. Now I'm going to show you what I do to kind of achieve this across my mix. So this is going to be based on if it's like a mix that's got drums in it, because for me, typically the drums are the loudest part of the mix. And so we're going to base the mix a lot around the drums. Typically on my drum bus, I'm going to have a limiter or a clipper, something at the end of the drum bus to say, nothing's getting past this point. This is where the transients end, no more. And now I don't even know where this number came from, because it's not like I saw someone do this and I said, this is how I'm going to do it. I just ended up here and it's become a kind of standard practice for me. But I might have the ceiling at around -4.5 dB. I don't know why, but that's sort of where I like to set it. I bring it down, and usually by the time I've done a bit of a drum mix, I'm getting a couple of dBs of gain reduction on my snare, and that gives me a nice healthy signal with my drums. So you can see right now, I'm not really hitting it that hard. I've even pulled down the threshold a little bit to add a little bit of extra juice to it. And once I start mixing this, maybe I'll push it a bit harder. Maybe I'll start to get a few more dBs of gain reduction going here, get the drums pumping a bit more. But at the moment, there's like 1 dB of gain reduction happening every now and then. But so that's kind of like where I'll set the drums. And then the rest of the mix kind of falls in line around the drums. And that's just how I like to mix these kind of songs. Like the drums are the punch and the power, and then I'll bring in all the elements around the drums and get a nice sounding mix. And if we have a look at our VU meter after the drums.
Now we're driving away from this one dog town, some kind of life that I know we won't.
So again, this is not by design, but we're getting our peaks hitting around that 0 and then all of the rest of it in between. And again, that's meant to be the sweet spot. And I haven't planned this. I haven't manufactured this, so it's like we're getting into that sweet spot. This is just how I've mixed and used my ears and ended up here. So even though I'm not thinking about gain staging all the time, apparently gain staging has just become a part of my natural process. So then we come over to our mix bus. I'm going to turn off the limiter on this mix, so it's going to get a little bit quieter now, but just so I can show you the levels down here. Turn everything off, right? This is our VU meter on the mix bus at the moment. Let's have a listen to what's going without any of my plugins on the mix bus.
I can see there's a chance we'll be happy now. We're driving away from this one dog town, some kind of life that I know we won't find here.
All right, so you can see it's getting into the red, it's getting a little hot, and then even on the mix bus, we hit -0.7. So we weren't going over at any point there. Maybe when the chorus hits, it might go over and we might start clipping. So that's not great, right? That's not what we want. And what you could do is you could basically just pull down any of your buses or any sounds that are going directly to your mix bus. You could just highlight all of that stuff, bring it down until you're getting into that sort of -6, -3 dB peak sort of area. But something that I've always sort of done is I have just set up a trim on my mix bus. And this is different to pulling down your mix bus. This is just some gain at the start to pull the overall mix back a little bit so that when it's being fed into plugins and processors after that trim, it's actually coming in then at a reasonable, healthy signal as opposed to coming in hot like it is at the moment. So typically I have something like Slate's VMR, a -6 dB trim, and then I have VCC after it. So let's have a look at the VU meters after this trim. Let's see where we're sitting then. That's sitting pretty healthy now. We can see down here we're getting -6.3 on the peaks, and that's what we kind of want. We want to keep this in sort of like a healthy area, and then we want to keep this just a little bit away from the top so that we aren't going to have any unnecessary clipping happening. And I do believe that this is part of gain staging for me anyway. Like, we've done our mix, we're making sure that it all meets up at the mix bus correctly, and then making sure that anything that's then fed into processes like our next thing up is our compressor, so that this is being fed in at a healthy signal that's not too hot. We're not going to kind of overload the input of this plugin, and that then when we play with the parameters, it's going to react in a nice way.
We can just drive, baby. We can just drive. There's nothing but road in the horizon.
So hopefully that makes sense. That's my typical approach to gain staging a band mix. Again, it starts with the drums, having that kind of -4.5 dB ceiling, and then also having the trim on my mix bus so that by the time everything's mixed and meets up, it's not having any issues and it's not overloading any plugins. Sure, I could mix things a little bit quieter. I could bring my faders down. That's personal choice. And again, there's no difference between putting a trim before that mix bus processing as opposed to having your faders quieter. Everything's meeting up at this point, and that little bit of trim is just literally bringing everything down to a safe signal. Some of you might not like that, but that's literally just something I've done for a really long time. I've seen some big mixers do that. And again, that's the point where there's things in gain staging where you can really care about them. You can go, no, you need to make sure that the faders are lower so that you don't have to have a trim at the mix bus. Whereas literally, like, I don't care. I'm happy with how everything's set. That -6 dB trim is like, it's no worries to me. I'm not even gonna double think that. Like, it's totally fine. And it is different to if you were just to pull down your mix bus. You know, your mix bus is too hot here and you go, oh, I need to pull this down 6 dB. That's different to having a trim at the front of your mix bus because we're trimming before the processing. And so it's hitting the processors at a healthy level. Whereas this is just like, crap, I'm peaking out. Let's pull it down, turn it down. So that's the difference. I also just think of gain staging as like good project management. When you open up your session, you can see the faders. Nothing's really going over zero too much. Like, nothing's going too far down. We've just got a nice, healthy sort of mix here where we've got enough room to play with the faders to get what we want out of them. Sometimes I get sent projects sort of just by like amateur mixers, and that's fine. I'm not judging anyone, but they won't have understood how to gain stage their project properly, and there'll be faders that are pushed up to +6 and they're going into the red, and then there'll be like something that's way too hot and it's pulled all the way down to -50, and then on their mix bus it'll be going into like -8 on the red, but they'll still have it pulled down -10 dB, and it's a bit of a mess really. And there'll be unwanted distortion from like plugins being like pushed too hard. It's basically just poor management. So I guess, yes, gain staging matters, but not to the point where you have to do it a certain way. It has to be done this way. You have to normalize your tracks to a certain decibel level. No, obviously it's all preferential, it's all subjective, but those are my thoughts on gain staging and how to set it up for a nice successful mix without too much noise and without kind of getting a mess going on your faders in your project. Probably forgotten something. I'm kind of winging this, sort of like trying to show you how I think about this and how I go about it in my sessions, and how I don't really think about this and how it's just a natural process for me. I think that's really important because I don't think you should be stressing about gain staging, but I think you should be aware of making sure that the gains aren't causing you any issues in your mixes. I know there's going to be some opinions on this, so drop them in the comments below. Keen to hear what you think. And if you want to support this channel, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe. Check out the description below. Check out my website. Check out my range of drum samples and mix courses. Really appreciate any support. And if you guys want to stick around for another video, make sure you check out this next one coming up. We're going to take you through some of my favorite hacks for better recordings and mixing.